All right, to respect everybody's time, we are going to get started here. I'm going to do a brief little intro and then I'll hand it over to Michael. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining our virtual Lunch and Learn today. We are excited to have both members and non-members of the Milwaukee County Historical Society joining us today. For those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit historical membership society in downtown Milwaukee. The mission of the MCHS is to recognize and preserve our local history. In promoting a greater appreciation of Milwaukee County's history, the Historical Society hopes to develop a better understanding of issues and challenges facing Milwaukee County today. The MCHS Museum and Research Center is located on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive in downtown Milwaukee. Through this series, we hope to bring the MCHS to your homes, and with that, by diving into a variety of topics centered on Milwaukee history and culture. Today's program is Transportation in Milwaukee, Part One, Steel Wheels and Shipping with MCHS Assistant Archivist and Digitization Specialist Michael Barera. My name is Olivia Hoff, and I am the MCHS Community Programs Manager, and I will be hosting this program. Before we get started, I do want to do a few reminders on using Zoom. Please keep your microphone muted. You can mute yourself by clicking the microphone button in the bottom left of your screen. There should be a red slash through the microphone. If you have a question, please write your question in the chat. When writing in the chat, make sure to select everyone as the recipient. Also, this program is being recorded for viewers who are unable to attend the program. If you do not want your likeness to be recorded, please turn off your camera. For best viewing, please click the view button in the right upper hand corner of your screen and select speaker view. Lastly, if you are having tech issues, please let us know in the chat. And with that, let me introduce Michael. Michael Barera has been the Assistant Archivist and Digitization Specialist at the Milwaukee County Historical Society since June 2022. Prior to that, he was the University and Labor Archivist at the University of Texas in Arlington Libraries from 2019 to 22, and Assistant Archivist at Texas A&M University Commerce Libraries from 2015 to 2019. A native of Ann Arbor, Michigan, he is a twice graduate of the University of Michigan with a Bachelor's of Arts and a Master of Science Information. Michael has extensive presenting experience, including presentations at Midwest Archives Conference Annual Meeting, the Society of American Archivists Annual Conference, the Society of Southwest Archivists Annual Conference, the Texas Center for Working Class Studies Conference, and the Texas Library Association Annual Conference. Since January 23, he is also a member of the MCHS Speakers Bureau, which gives presentations to groups around Milwaukee County. The 6 presentations that he gives on behalf of the Speakers Bureau are on Milwaukee's rivers, its founders, professional baseball in the city, the Wisconsin State Fair, and 2 new presentations on transportation in Milwaukee, steel wheels and shipping, and rubber wheels and aviation. I will now pass it over to Michael.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Again, I'm Michael Barera, and today it is my pleasure to present to you Transportation in Milwaukee, Steel Wheels and Shipping, one of 2 new presentations I've created that document the history of transit in the city. This presentation focuses on steel-wheeled forms of transportation, trains, streetcars, and interurbans, plus ships and boats. It runs approximately 1 hour. But first, a few acknowledgements. Most of the content in my presentation today comes from a large variety of articles about Milwaukee transportation in the Encyclopedia of Milwaukee, which is produced and made available by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, UWM. Also contributing substantially to my research on the streetcars portion of this presentation was Clay McShane's 1974 book, Technology and Reform, Street Railways, and the Growth of Milwaukee, 1887 to 1900. Almost all the photography in this presentation is from the extensive photographic collections at the Milwaukee County Historical Society, where I work. The only exception is a single recent photo of the modern hop streetcar taken in the last couple of years that I took myself. Also of special note, most of the color railroad photography since 2000 was photographed and donated by Eamon A. Rago and is now here in the MCHS collections. We are located in the former Second Ward Savings Bank pictured here at the corner of Martin Luther King Jr. Drive and Kilbourne Avenue in downtown Milwaukee. Today's presentation covers steel wheels and shipping, ships and boats, railroads, and streetcars in interurbans. I have another presentation of approximately equal length that covers rubber wheels and aviation, early roads, streets, buses, automobiles and freeways, bicycles, and aviation and airports. We will begin today with a section on ships and boats, the first important means of transportation in what is now Milwaukee. Prior to European contact, Native Americans living in what is now Milwaukee navigated the Milwaukee, Menomonee, and Kinnickinnick rivers, as well as Lake Michigan, typically via canoe. Local natives used both birch bark canoes and dugout canoes for traveling on water, usually along the rivers. They harvested wild rice and fish, especially around the Milwaukee River Delta and in the harbor. This image is an early drawing of Native Americans harvesting wild rice from a canoe, most likely on the Menomonee River. In the 17th century, canoes remained the most common means of transportation on water around present-day Milwaukee, despite occasional European sailing vessels on the Great Lakes. As an example of this, the Marquette and Joliet expedition that briefly stopped in modern-day Milwaukee in the 1670s was by canoe. The first sailing ship to dock at what is now Milwaukee arrived in 1778, 70 years before Wisconsin achieved statehood. The story of shipping in Milwaukee begins with its ideal location to build a port, as the city has the broadest bay and the deepest natural harbor on the west coast of Lake Michigan. Assisted by the development of railroads, the Port of Milwaukee, pictured here circa 1930s, helped to make the city a major hub for the transportation of freight. The development of a port in Milwaukee was aided by the city's location on Lake Michigan and its proximity to productive agricultural land in Wisconsin, and in the upper Midwest more broadly. The first major commodity to be shipped from Milwaukee was grain, with shipments almost exclusively heading east. The completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 had a major positive impact on Milwaukee's transportation viability for both freight and passenger shipping. In 1835, the steamer Michigan became the first steamship to dock at Milwaukee, predating the construction of the city's first pier. In the 19th century, wheat and corn comprised the majority of the goods that were shipped from Milwaukee, although the city also shipped lumber and coal. Additionally, the port and railroads facilitated the development of heavy industry in the city, which would soon become another major export. In the 1950s, both the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Union Pacific Railroad were connected to the rail yards in the Menomonee Valley, further enabling trade. The opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959 made Milwaukee's port more competitive, as it allowed direct access to the east coast of North America as well as to Europe. Freight from inland Wisconsin typically arrived at the Port of Milwaukee or the Menomonee Valley by rail, where it was stored and ultimately transloaded onto ships. The first passenger and cargo docks to be built in Milwaukee were constructed by the early 1840s, but these proved to be short-lived. In 1843, local support was building for a straight cut, quote-unquote, a channel cut through the naturally occurring sandbar that separated the Milwaukee River from Lake Michigan at a narrow point about a half-mile north of its natural mouth. Without substantial federal aid, in 1854, Milwaukee citizens voted for a local tax to create the straight cut, pictured in this circa 1860 drawing. It was completed in 1857 at the cost of nearly $450,000, worth over $16 million today, well over budget. However, a major reason it was completed at such a cost was the highly lucrative nature of the grain shipping market at the time. Regardless of the cost, its completion substantially increased Milwaukee's ability to compete for lake traffic with other cities, especially Chicago. The straight cut gave ships much more direct access to the harbor and to the Milwaukee River, with its growing number of warehouses. The success was bittersweet, though, as in 1852, the first railroad from the east arrived in Chicago. While the populations and commercial output of Chicago and Milwaukee remained comparable from 1835 to 1850, railroads would quickly allow Chicago to assert itself as the most populous city and dominant commercial center in the Midwest. Regardless, in the words of Cody Schreck, despite the dangers inherent in the Great Lakes shipping business, water transportation transformed Milwaukee from a fur trading post into a bustling port city, quote unquote. Ultimately, though, Milwaukee's position as a major shipping center on the Great Lakes was reduced both by the growth of wheat shipping from the Twin Cities and the success of railroads in taking freight traffic away from ships. In 1854, James Monroe Jones began building ships on what is today called Jones Island, pictured here in 1950, in his honor. But major storms and the Panic of 1857 decimated his business and led him to leave for Detroit. Regardless, ship construction continued in Milwaukee, with the Wolf and Davidson shipyards becoming the largest in the city and one of the most significant in the Great Lakes region by the late 19th century. From the 1870s into the early 20th century, Jones Island was home to Kashubian immigrants from Poland and Pomeranian immigrants from Germany, who created an informal village with as many as 1,600 residents and an economy based around fishing. In 1918, the Milwaukee Sewerage Commission began constructing a full-scale wastewater treatment plant on Jones Island. The plant became operational in 1925 and removed over 95% of bacteria and over 90% of solids from Milwaukee sewage, considered remarkable for the time. As of 2022, the treated wastewater returned to Lake Michigan from the Jones Island facility is actually cleaner than the lake water itself. Almost certainly the most infamous water disaster in Milwaukee's history was the sinking of the Lady Elgin, pictured here, off the coast of Winnetka, Illinois, on September 8, 1860. One of the worst maritime disasters ever to occur on the Great Lakes. Over 300 of the more than 400 aboard that night died in the sinking. The ship was hit by the lumber schooner Augusta in heavy rain and strong winds. The Lady Elgin's passengers were largely Irish Americans living in Milwaukee's Third Ward, and a sizable number were members of the city's Union Guards militia, which was aligned with the Democratic Party and opposed to abolitionist Wisconsin Governor Alexander Randall. In the 1870s, lake traffic in Milwaukee was significant, as on average, more ships passed through the harbor each day that decade than the number of aircraft that took off or landed from Milwaukee Mitchell International Airport in 2016. Shipping was vital to the development of industry in Milwaukee. Ultimately, because of both its river and railroad connections, the Menomonee Valley became the preferred location for most manufacturing in the city. In 1869, the Menomonee Improvement Company began landfill work in the valley, reducing bluffs surrounding the area and using the earth from them to build solid ground on what had been marshland. By 1900, more than 1,400 acres of land in the Menomonee Valley had been built via this process. The canals and rail infrastructure built in this area were what John Gerda called perhaps the best transportation infrastructure in the state, quote unquote. Merging alongside the meatpacking plants, lumber mills, and tanneries that already existed in the Menomonee River Valley, pictured here along the 900 block of West Canal Street, were a host of new manufacturing businesses, including foundries, machine shops, and stamping works. The valley became home to both hundreds of smaller employers as well as major companies that gained widespread recognition, including Chainbelt, Falk, Harnisch-Fager, and the Milwaukee Road. Working-class neighborhoods developed on both the north and south sides of the valley. Ultimately, the Menomonee Valley became more than just the greatest industrial area in the state. It rivaled the greatest industrial areas in the world at the time. All of them, perhaps unsurprisingly, were located along rivers that allowed shipping to serve them. The Cuyahoga in Cleveland, the Monongahela in Pittsburgh, and the Ruhr in Western Germany. Another key early shipping project in Milwaukee, although ultimately unsuccessful, was the attempt to build a major canal. Byron Kilbourne, one of the founders of the city and an early mayor, was inspired by how Chicago built a canal to connect the Chicago River with the Illinois River and thus, ultimately, the Mississippi River. During the period sometimes referred to as canal mania, quote unquote, in the mid 19th century, he advocated for the same approach here in Wisconsin, with his goal being a canal that linked the Mississippi River with the Rock River at Fort Atkinson. Linked the Milwaukee River with the Rock River at Fort Atkinson. As with Chicago's canal, the Rock River likewise connects to the Mississippi River, using a route that included the lakes in the Lake Country portion of Waukesha County. Kilbourne's Milwaukee and Rock River Canal Company was chartered in 1838. With early support from both the U.S. Congress and the Wisconsin Territorial Legislature, Kilbourne began building his canal. However, lack of sufficient funds for construction and worsening perceptions of the canal project from both prominent politicians, most notably Governor James Doty, and settlers resulted in the canal falling out of favor. Only a dam, the long-standing North Avenue Dam, and 1.25 miles of the canal were ever constructed before the project was abandoned in 1842. Pictured here is the short stretch of completed canal, which today lies beneath Commerce Street. While Kilbourne lost nearly $30,000 on the canal, worth about $1.1 million today, and it failed to contribute to transportation in the region, the aborted canal did become a key source of power for local industry and remained as such into the 1860s. It was the first true industrial area of the city, known simply as the water power, quote unquote. While shipping freight strongly contributed to the growth and development of Milwaukee, passenger ships also played important roles, including providing passage for immigrants coming to Milwaukee, especially before the popularization and proliferation of railroads. Arguably the most famous passenger ship to ever sail into Milwaukee was the SS Christopher Columbus, pictured here, a whaleback steamship that was constructed in 1892 for the Columbian Exposition in Chicago the following year. After the fair, it went into regular service between Chicago and Milwaukee, sailing the route until 1933. It was known for its large size. Its capacity of 5,000 people and length of 362 feet made it briefly the Queen of the Lakes, the longest active vessel on the Great Lakes, in 1892 and 93. The ship carried 1.7 million people during the Columbian Exposition, and over its entire career, it is believed to have carried more people than any other vessel on the lakes. The African-American experience in Milwaukee began by ship. Joe Oliver, who was likely the first African-American in the area, initially came to what is now Milwaukee in 1835 to work for Solomon Juneau. He had previously been employed as a cook on ships sailing the Great Lakes. He was able to vote in the first election in Milwaukee before the Wisconsin Territory disenfranchised him along with other people of color, the indigent, and those with mental health conditions. Pictured here is John Jones standing on the deck of the SS Christopher Columbus in August 1922 from the John and Etta Jones collection. Working both on steamships and railroads in the early 20th century, by the early 1930s, Jones began working as a dental assistant in laboratory settings. In this line of work, he produced dentures and orthodontic appliances for dentists. In the 1930s, he became manager of the OK Dental Laboratory, and by the early 1940s, he had founded his own business, the Jones Dental Laboratory. By the mid-20th century, he was a member of Milwaukee's black middle class. His amateur photography, preserved in the John and Etta Jones collection, is today one of the most interesting photo collections at the MCHS, and the first collection to be digitized in its entirety. While railroads curtailed and sometimes made obsolete some forms of shipping, most notably canals, one case in which they aided shipping was the development of car ferries. Their origins were in the need of railroads to transport rail cars across bodies of water too large to span by either bridges or tunnels. By the mid-19th century, shortly after the creation of the first car ferry in Scotland, they made their Great Lakes debut on the Buffalo and Lake Huron Railway Company. Car ferries connecting Milwaukee to cities across Lake Michigan grew largely due to the development of heavy manufacturing in the city in the late 19th century. By the early 20th century, the Pere Marquette Railway was the dominant line, operating 13 different routes serving Milwaukee from 1900 to 1950. Most of these ferries transported freight, with the typical car ferry capable of carrying about 30 average-sized rail cars. Along with some of its competitors, the Père Marquette also added passenger services, with some of its Great Lakes ferries carrying as many as 5,000 people daily. Pictured is an undated view of the car ferry Père Marquette 19. After World War I, the Père Marquette expanded its passenger car ferry operations, developing a reputation for luxury and customer service. Car ferries were redesigned to accommodate automobiles as cars grew in popularity. Built in 1953, the SS Badger, pictured on this 1954 postcard, is still operational today as a car ferry between Manitowoc and Ludington, Michigan. From the 1950s through the early 1970s, it regularly served Milwaukee, sailing for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. It has been operated by the Lake Michigan Car Ferry Service on its present route out of Manitowoc since 1992. It is now the last coal-powered passenger steamship in the U.S. The modern high-speed Lake Express car ferry has connected Milwaukee to Muskegon from May through October since its debut in 2004. Its higher cruising speed, 39 miles an hour versus 18 miles an hour for the Badger, allows it to make 3 round-trip crossings a day, compared to just 1 round-trip crossing for the Badger during daylight hours. The next section discusses railroads in considerable detail, both historically and in the present day. Milwaukee enthusiastically eyed railroads in the mid-19th century, as they were highly beneficial for both shipping and receiving goods, and they significantly improved the ability of immigrants to reach the city. While railroad growth in Milwaukee never matched what occurred in Chicago in the 1860s or St. Louis in the 1870s, the city's boosters and residents hoped that the development of local railroads would help the emerging metropolis compete with its Midwestern rivals. The first railroad in Milwaukee was Byron Kilbourne's Milwaukee and Waukesha Railroad, later renamed the Milwaukee and Mississippi. It began laying down track in 1850 and reached Waukesha in 1851, with just over 20 miles of track connecting it to Milwaukee. Pictured is the Milwaukee and Waukesha's engine number 71 in Waukesha in 1851. Built in 1848, it has the distinction of being the first operational locomotive in Wisconsin. The railroad reached Madison in 1854 and ultimately its namesake destination, the Mississippi River, in 1857. In 1852, Kilbourne established the La Crosse and Milwaukee Railroad after being fired by the board of directors of the Milwaukee and Mississippi. The La Crosse and Milwaukee built its line through Horicon, Beaver Dam, and Portage before ultimately reaching La Crosse on the Mississippi River in 1858. This route would eventually become the Milwaukee Road's main line from Minneapolis, St. Paul to Milwaukee. By 1855, Milwaukee was connected to Chicago by rail, and it was connected to Minneapolis and St. Paul by 1867. One of the first railway post office, or RPO, routes in the United States was established between Chicago and Milwaukee in the mid-1860s. Connection to other major cities in the Midwest and the broader development of the American rail system allowed the Menomonee Valley to become the center of railroading in Milwaukee, both for passenger and freight service, as well as a major location for building and servicing rail cars. Milwaukee became a major center of wheat transportation, as well as for corn, lumber, and coal. Railroads were ultimately a double-edged sword for Milwaukee. While they allowed Chicago to consolidate its position as the premier transit hub in the Midwest and become the freight handler of the nation, quote unquote, they also allowed Milwaukee to develop into the major commercial hub in Wisconsin and helped its brewing industry reach a national market by the late 19th century. Observing how the new railroad infrastructure meshed so well with existing water-based shipping, Karen W. Moore writes that by 1863, this highly efficient rail-water shipping trade had transformed Milwaukee into the wheat capital of the world, quote unquote. Pictured is the grain exchange, symbolic of the height of Milwaukee's trade in grain. The exchange was in the Chamber of Commerce, or Mackey Building. The history of the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad, commonly known as simply the Milwaukee Road, long before it officially became a trademark of the railroad in 1953, dates to the establishment of the Milwaukee and Waukesha in 1847. As part of its long history, it gained the distinction of being the first railroad to connect Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. Kilbourne's Milwaukee and Waukesha was renamed the Milwaukee and Mississippi after it reached the Mississippi River, before ultimately becoming the Milwaukee and Prairie du Chien Railroad. In 1852, after being fired by the board of directors of his first railroad, Kilbourne created the second railroad in the state, the La Crosse and Milwaukee Railroad, stock certificate pictured here, which reached the La Crosse River in 1858. The Panic of 1857 and resulting lack of available capital severely hampered the construction of further railroads in Wisconsin prior to the Civil War. In 1863, banker and railroad financier Alexander Mitchell reorganized the La Crosse and Milwaukee as the Milwaukee and St. Paul Railway. By 1865, Mitchell owned almost half the railway miles in the state. In 1867, he also acquired the Milwaukee and Prairie du Chien and added it to his growing railroad empire, by which point he included both Kilbourne's pioneering railroads. In the words of railroad historian and writer H. Roger Grant, Mitchell's network of railroads transformed Milwaukee into a hub for shipment of wheat from Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa on such a scale that it rivaled Chicago, quote unquote. Mitchell's railroad continued to grow, reaching Chicago in 1873, adding the city to its name in 1874, and moving its general office there in 1890. Pictured as Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul engine number 337 on a turntable. This engine was built in 1893 in the railroad's own shops. The Milwaukee Road expanded west through the upper Midwest and northern Great Plains and ultimately reached Washington's Puget Sound by 1909. During its first of three bankruptcies from 1925 to 28, the railroad officially changed its name to the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad. Regardless, it was still popularly called the Milwaukee Road. In 1879 and 80, the Milwaukee Road opened its West Milwaukee shops, pictured here, which became a major fixture and key employer in the Menomonee River Valley for decades to come. Between 1880 and 1938, Milwaukee Road employees built almost 700 steam locomotives in-house at these shops, which ultimately expanded to 160 acres of land. Similarly, under the innovative leadership of Chief Mechanical Officer Carl F. Nystrom, the railroad built its own freight and passenger cars in an era when most railroads purchased their cars from companies that specialized in building them. Nystrom held over 100 patents and was perhaps most famous for developing smooth-riding trucks for passenger cars, as well as lightweight boxcars. The Milwaukee Road also built its iconic Hiawatha streamlined train sets at these shops in the 1930s. The neighborhood of Merrill Park, nearby to the shops, developed as a residential area for shop workers, who numbered 1,200 by 1883. Many workers walked to the shops or rode a nearby streetcar to work, and there were multiple generations of Merrill Park residents who worked for the Milwaukee Road. By 1947, roughly 3,500 people worked in the Milwaukee Road shops, although employment declined to roughly 900 in the late 1970s and to just 225 in 1832, only 2 years before the ultimate demise of the railroad and shortly before the closing of the shops. By 1900, the Milwaukee Road boasted over 6,500 miles of track. At the turn of the 20th century, the Milwaukee Road was the largest single employer in Milwaukee, with 5,500 employees. In the early 20th century, its premier passenger trains included the Pioneer Limited and the Milwaukee-Chicago Special. By 1927, its roster of employees had expanded to 8,000, and chairman of the board, Harry E. Byram, announced its payroll was $12.5 million that year, over $223 million today, claimed to be the largest in the city at the time. In the 1930s, the Milwaukee Road launched its flagship Hiawatha passenger trains. Pictured here is Milwaukee Road diesel EMD E6 locomotive number 15 pulling the Hiawatha, circa 1940s. The Milwaukee Road utilized its main line and branch lines, along with its large Menomonee Valley classification yard, as the backbone for fast and efficient freight service. In 1963, it began operating its Thunderhawk and XL special freight services, which briefly claimed the title for fastest service between Chicago, Milwaukee, and the Pacific Northwest. The Milwaukee Road, like its rival Chicago and Northwestern, but at a larger scale, carried coal, grain, and lumber into Milwaukee and beer, machinery, and other goods out of it. They both, but the Milwaukee Road especially, benefited from major businesses in the city and the county in the early to mid 20th century, especially Alice Chalmers, Freighter Malt, Krause Milling, and the big four Milwaukee breweries, Blatz, Miller, Pabst, and Schlitz. At its peak in the 1970s, the Milwaukee Road had over 10,000 miles of rail running from the Midwest all the way to the Pacific Northwest. The railroad came to be known and celebrated for both its passenger and freight service, the capabilities of its shop, and the work of its employees. Pictured is Milwaukee Road EMD GP30 locomotive shortly after its construction at LaGrange, Illinois, circa early 1960s. Easily identifiable with its distinctive stepped roof design, the GP30 was built for hauling freight trains. The Milwaukee Road filed for bankruptcy for the third and final time in 1977, slashing its system length to just over 3,200 miles in the process. It also drastically reduced its roster of employees, but it operated under its name until December 31st, 1985. At that point, it was acquired by the Soo Line Railroad. Pictured as former Milwaukee Road E9 diesel locomotive number 37A in retirement at the Illinois Railway Museum in Union, Illinois. The West Milwaukee shops continued to operate after the railroad became part of the Soo Line, ultimately closing 1 year later in December 1986. Ultimately, the Soo Line became a fallen flag as well, as defunct railroads are often called, when it was acquired by the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1990. Famous photographers to capture the Milwaukee Road include celebrated Wisconsin Dells photographer Henry H. Bennett and Lena Bertucci, who began working as a brakeman for the railroad in 1974 while also studying at UWM. Bertucci worked alongside fellow pioneering female brakemen Karina Bertucci and Cindy Angelos. Other notable Milwaukee Road employees include Hugh McManus, engineer on the first Hiawatha to depart Chicago, Ron Morales, a Hispanic locomotive engineer, and perhaps most famously, Soda Ash Johnny, John M. Horan, who worked for the railroad for almost 83 years before his death in 1938. Pictured as Milwaukee Road Class A 442 locomotive number 1 leaving Milwaukee Union Depot circa 1940s, perhaps the most enduring image of the Milwaukee Road. Although its roots do not go back quite as far as the Milwaukee Roads, the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, C&NW, or simply the Northwestern, traces its Milwaukee area heritage to two early 1850s lines that connected Chicago to Milwaukee. They were the Illinois Parallel Railroad and the Green Bay, Milwaukee, and Chicago Railroad. And these linked Chicago with Milwaukee a full 2 decades before the Milwaukee Road made the connection. Those two lines were consolidated as the Chicago and Milwaukee Railway, or C&M, in 1863. The Northwestern, which itself was formed in 1859, began leasing the C&M in 1866 and officially acquired it as part of its own system in 1881. From that point, the Northwestern entered into direct competition with the Milwaukee Road in the Chicago to Milwaukee corridor. Throughout the late 19th and into the early 20th centuries, the Northwestern grew its footprint in Wisconsin. It connected Milwaukee to Madison in 1882 and reached Ashland in Wisconsin's Northwoods and Gogebic, the Gogebic Iron Range in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, with its acquisition of the Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western Railway in 1893. In 1910 and 11, the Northwestern subsidiary, the Milwaukee, Sparta, and Northwestern Railway, built the 135-mile-long Adams Cutoff between Sparta and Lindworm, the latter just 8 miles north of Milwaukee. This completed a high-speed route between Chicago, Milwaukee, and the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. With lines heading north, west, and south out of Milwaukee, the Northwestern was a direct and fierce competitor with the Milwaukee Road. Pictured here is a Northwestern passenger train running along Milwaukee's Lake Michigan shoreline on the Northwestern's Chicago to Twin Cities main line in 1932. By the outbreak of World War I, the Northwestern had nearly 10,000 miles of track, making it one of the largest railroads in the country. It was also widely regarded as one of the wealthiest, which was reflected in its motto, "the best of everything," quote unquote. Long renowned for its passenger operations, with early 20th century trains such as the Northwestern Limited and Badger State Express, the Northwestern connected Milwaukeeans to Chicago, the Twin Cities, and Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Between 1930 and 33, the Northwestern even allied with Kohler Aviation Corporation to offer commercial flights between Milwaukee and Grand Rapids, Michigan. Despite the railroad entering receivership during the Great Depression, in 1935, it introduced its most famous passenger train, the 400. This train was named for the time, in minutes, and the distance, in miles, it took to cover between Chicago, Milwaukee, and the Twin Cities. Originally powered by steam, the 400 was dieselized in 1939 to reduce costs, and its brand value proved so great that other Northwestern passenger trains began using it, such as the Peninsula 400 and the Flambeau 400. Pictured as a Northwestern EMD E6 diesel engine leading a train at Milwaukee, likely the 400, in 1941. By the mid-1950s, the Northwestern, like the Milwaukee Road, was no longer running steam engines. The Northwestern began to cut back on its passenger services after its bankruptcy and again after World War II, ultimately slashing it drastically in 1956. Like the Milwaukee Road, it faced increasing competition from cars, trucks, and aircrafts. This occurred in an environment in which the government subsidized both roads and aviation, but did not subsidize railroads, all while still tightly regulating them, continuing to treat them as the monopolies they clearly were during the Gilded Age. However, freight traffic on the Northwestern remained strong and kept it in business, especially its coal shipments from Wyoming. In 1972, under the administration of Ben Heineman, the railroad was sold to its employees, with the former management citing higher competition from automobiles, labor costs, and regulation as their rationale. Regardless, the railroad stayed profitable during this period, where it proudly incorporated the words employee-owned into its insignia. It acquired other railroads, such as the Minneapolis and St. Louis and the Chicago Great Western, while also seriously considering a merger with the Milwaukee Road that never happened. Its trackage, especially connections from Nebraska to Chicago, was perceived as valuable in the eyes of other railroads, and the Northwestern was acquired by the Union Pacific Railroad in 1995. Pictured as former Northwestern EMD GP7R number 4160 at the Illinois Railway Museum in 2014. Just before World War I, the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Sault Ste. Marie Railway, commonly known as the Soo Line, became the third major railroad to serve Milwaukee, although its impact on the city never rivaled that of the Milwaukee Road or the Northwestern. In 1908, it acquired a majority interest in the Wisconsin Central Railroad, which had reached Milwaukee via a trackage rights deal with the Milwaukee Road in the late 1880s and had established itself as a major hauler of flour, grain, and lumber. Like the Wisconsin Central, the Soo Line was interested in Lake Michigan ferries and to connect to ports in Michigan. Two other railroads, the Grand Trunk and Pere Marquette, also served Milwaukee via car ferries, as we've already seen. The Soo Line's modest passenger train service in Milwaukee used the Milwaukee Road station. Pictured here is former Soo Line H21 class 462 locomotive number 2713 on display at Stevens Point, Wisconsin. Railroads provided both new economic opportunities and segregated job roles for African Americans, who were almost universally hired as either Pullman sleeping car porters or dining car staff, predominantly cooks or waiters, into the mid-20th century. Pictured are two black waiters serving dining room passengers on the Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee Railroad, the North Shore Line, undated, likely 1920s. The server to the right rear is John Jones, who worked as a waiter and dining car porter for the North Shore Line after his service in the U.S. Army during World War I, from the John and Etta Jones collection. Work as Pullman porters represented arguably the first well-paying jobs for African Americans after the Civil War, but the workload was demanding and exhausting, and work as higher paid and more prestigious positions such as conductors and locomotive engineers remained practically impossible for decades. Nonetheless, Pullman porters were key to the early civil rights movement. They formed the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925, the first Black labor union to be affiliated with the American Federation of Labor, and many porters were also members of the NAACP. Wisconsin's very first railroad, the Milwaukee and Waukesha, later Milwaukee and Mississippi, started construction in Milwaukee in 1850 and built its first station in the city at the corner of 2nd Street and Fowler Street, now St. Paul Avenue. That first station is pictured here. This location was just 3 blocks east of the current Milwaukee Intermodal Station. The Milwaukee and Waukesha's first station was a simple, unadorned, 2-room station built in the board and batten style, with both its waiting room for passengers and the station agent's room equipped with potbelly stoves. As Milwaukee grew rapidly during the 1850s, it soon outgrew this first station, and a new depot was built on Reed Street. This station was used by the Milwaukee Road and 2 other railroads at the time, the Milwaukee and Northern Railway and the Wisconsin Central Railroad. In 1886, the Milwaukee Road opened its dramatically designed station at 317 West Everett Street, which featured an extremely prominent 140-foot tall clock tower. The station was designed by legendary Milwaukee architect Edward Townsend Mix, primarily in the Gothic Revival architectural style, although his design also included elements of Queen Anne and Romanesque Revival architecture. Author and historian Kim Schutte describes this station as providing a grand entrance to Milwaukee, quote unquote. It was modified over the years before being replaced in 1965 by a new station that is now the current Milwaukee Intermodal Station on St. Paul Avenue. The Everett Street Station burned in a fire just one week after its closure in August 1965, and the fire-damaged building was demolished the following year, 1966. In 1889, the Northwestern opened its own grand station, designed by architects Charles Sumner Frost and Alfred Hoyt Granger, costing $200,000, over $6.9 million today, to build. It was constructed of stone in the Romanesque style at the east end of Wisconsin Avenue along Milwaukee's lakefront, on the site of the present-day Betty Bryn Children's Museum. At its zenith, the Northwestern's lakefront station served 98 trains a day. Like the Milwaukee Road Station, the Northwestern's featured a prominent clock tower and was perhaps even more of a city landmark than its more inland rival. It closed in May 1966, less than a year after the Milwaukee Road's Everett Street Station, and the Northwestern subsequently began using the Milwaukee Road's new station, the current Milwaukee Intermodal Station, for its passenger service in the city. Milwaukee County purchased the lakefront station for $7 million, over $62 million today, with plans to demolish it for the construction of a freeway along the city's Lake Michigan shoreline, although that freeway was never built. Despite efforts to preserve the station, it was demolished in 1968. This loss catalyzed the historic preservation movement in Milwaukee, leading to the creation of what is now Historic Milwaukee Incorporated. Today, the Northwestern's lakefront station, Milwaukee Road's Everett Street Station, Pabst Building, and the Elizabeth Plankinton Mansion on Wisconsin Avenue are usually considered among the greatest losses of historic architecture in Milwaukee's history. Originally opened in August 1965 by the Milwaukee Road, the St. Paul Avenue station was designed by Donald L. Grebe. It also served the Northwestern between 1966 and 71. Pictured as this is the station as it appeared in 2002, before being remodeled. Now owned by the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, it was extensively remodeled in 2007 at the cost of $16.9 million, over $25.6 million today, and renamed Milwaukee Intermodal Station. Remaining in operation under that name today, it is home to Amtrak Intercity Rail, the 7 round-trip daily Hiawatha between Milwaukee and Chicago, and the once daily Empire Builder between Chicago and Seattle and Portland. And starting later this month, the new once daily Borealis between Chicago and Minneapolis-St. Paul. The station also serves intercity bus lines, including Badger Bus, Coach USA and Wisconsin Coach Lines, Greyhound, Indian Trails, and more. Over 1 million passengers use this station every year, and it is also a stop on several Milwaukee County Transit System, or MCTS, bus lines. Opened in June 2004, there is also a small Amtrak station on the western edge of Milwaukee Mitchell International Airport on South 6th Street, pictured here in 2005. It is one of 5 stations on the Hiawatha, and while it provides connections to the airport, its primary purpose is providing a more convenient location for Southsiders and those who live in the southern suburbs of Milwaukee to catch a Hiawatha to Chicago. In 1971, Amtrak, officially the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, was created, and it began operating the Hiawatha between downtown Milwaukee and Chicago's Union Station. Pictured is an Amtrak Hiawatha led by a former EMD F40PH locomotive modified into a control cab and baggage car, note the baggage door on its side, departing from Milwaukee Intermodal Station bound for Chicago in June 2002. Amtrak continues to operate passenger trains to this day, although service levels are reduced from their peak in the early to mid-20th century. Even as late as 1950, the Milwaukee Road operated 26 passenger trains with stops in Milwaukee, while the Northwestern operated 18, compared to 8 total Amtrak trains serving the city today. However, it's important to note that much of the country that is served by Amtrak only has a single daily round-trip train. Present-day railroading in Milwaukee also involves freight railroads, including short lines that have increased in number and popularity since the passage of the Federal Staggers Act in 1980, which partially deregulated smaller railroads. Among the post-1980 startups are the Wisconsin and Southern Railroad, which operates north of Milwaukee as far as Oshkosh, and the Wisconsin Central Limited, which acquired much of the former Milwaukee Road tracks and was ultimately itself purchased by the Canadian National Railway in 2001. Today, both the Canadian National and the new Canadian Pacific Kansas City, which has inherited the former Canadian Pacific's trackage in southeastern Wisconsin, have strong presences in the Milwaukee area. Pictured here is a Canadian Pacific train passing by the Milwaukee Airport Station in May 2005. In early 2011, Wisconsin was offered $810 million in federal funding, over $1.1 billion today, to build higher-speed passenger rail between Milwaukee and Madison. However, this money was turned down by then-Governor Scott Walker, even though the train sets, which have since been sold to Lagos, Nigeria, had already been built. Walker and Republicans in the legislature then repealed the Regional Transit Authority Act that had been passed in 2009, which would have given Milwaukee and its suburbs joint control over the development of new transportation initiatives. To this day, there is no regional coordination of transit in Greater Milwaukee. Milwaukee County and Waukesha County have their own fully fledged bus systems, while Ozaukee County and Washington County provide only commuter routes and paratransit services. The final section discusses Milwaukee's long history of streetcars, beginning with horse-drawn streetcars and then focusing primarily on electric streetcars. This section also discusses the interurbans that linked Milwaukee to its suburbs and other cities in the region. Prior even to the incorporation of the city of Milwaukee in 1846, private horse-drawn buses, omnibuses as they were known at the time, traveled on unpaved roads in the area, constituting the first form of mass transportation in what is now Milwaukee. However, as Clay McShane argues in his book on early street railways in Milwaukee, they were both uncomfortable and expensive, quote unquote, and walking remained the dominant form of transportation until the advent of streetcars. Prior to 1860, horse-drawn carriages were the only other meaningful form of transportation on Milwaukee's streets. In 1860, George Walker, one of Milwaukee's 3 founders and an early mayor, began operating the first horse-drawn streetcars in the city, running them on Water Street. Pictured here is a later horse-drawn streetcar, circa 1880, on the Grand Avenue, Wisconsin Avenue, and Wells Street line. Streetcars, which used railroad track buried in paved streets, benefited from increasing inner-city passenger travel and the movement of soldiers during the Civil War. The city of Milwaukee granted streetcar franchises and regulated them, and the competition was fierce. After the Civil War, there were four major streetcar lines in the city, two owned or backed by Democratic Party politicians, the Cream City Railroad Company and the Milwaukee City Railway Company, and two owned or backed by Republicans, the Whitefish Bay Railway Company and the West Side Railway Company, the latter popularly known as the Becker Line. Due to multiple private companies providing the service, fare structures were inconsistent and, when considered comprehensively, the routes were uncoordinated and inefficient. McShane notes that horse-drawn streetcars suffered from significant disadvantages, namely the relatively low pulling strength of a horse, the inability to add additional cars to meet increased demand, and difficulties in both hot weather due to horses fatiguing and becoming thirsty, in addition to snowy and icy weather, due to the difficulty of horses climbing hills under those conditions. McShane also observes that steam engines would have been the logical 19th century technological choice for replacing horse-drawn streetcars, but they were usually banned from operating on city streets due to both environmental and safety concerns. In April 1890, Milwaukee's first electric streetcar line began running on West Wells Street under the operation of the Milwaukee Street Railway Company, which was owned by New Jersey's North American Company, an umbrella corporation that owned multiple streetcar lines. The company was also highly involved in purchasing and consolidating streetcar lines here in Milwaukee. For the first few years of electric operation, several privately owned streetcar companies operated independently. With the help of local Republican leader Henry C. Payne, North American's owner, Henry Villard, began acquiring the numerous horse-drawn streetcars in Milwaukee, converting them to electrical power and consolidating them into a single company. Before North American completed its corporate consolidation, however, they entered bankruptcy due to the Panic of 1893. Pictured is the streetcar at the intersection of North 3rd Street and West Wisconsin Avenue, circa 1895. The portion of 3rd Street at the left of this photo is today the main entrance to 3rd Street Market Hall. In 1896, the Milwaukee Street Railway reemerged from bankruptcy to become the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company, often referred to as the TMER&L, which remained a wholly owned subsidiary of the North American Company. The success of Milwaukee's early electric streetcars helped to begin the pattern of suburbanization and normalize longer commutes. Streetcar suburbs, quote unquote, which were relatively close to the city by modern standards and relatively walkable as most residents did not yet own automobiles, developed in earnest in places like Bayview, Shorewood, and Wauwatosa. Pictured here is a large, undated group portrait of TMER&L employees, likely circa 1890s. They appear to be mostly shop employees. Note that they are all men and are overwhelmingly white. In this detail from the previous image, note the handful of executives wearing suits in the second row and one African-American employee centered in the third row directly behind the executives. Due to its bankruptcy, however, the TMER&L avoided paying many of the horse-drawn streetcar owners, generating ill will in the first public enemies of the new streetcar system. Pictured here is an undated view of an early electric streetcar at the intersection of South 1st, Mitchell, and Kinnickinnick, looking west. Note the spires of St. Stanislaus in the distance. In 1907, the state granted the TMER&L monopoly status in Greater Milwaukee, yet also allowed it to remain privately owned and publicly traded. This resulted in the TMER&L having dual responsibilities to its stockholders, mostly on the East Coast, and the Wisconsin Railroad Commission, but was not accountable to either municipal and government or the general public in Milwaukee. For this reason, its hostility to labor unions, opposition to lowering fares, and refusal to improve its equipment or services, the TMER&L alienated and angered many local residents, especially early in its existence. It also frustrated its own employees due to the wages and the conditions of their work. As author Karen W. Moore notes, most TMER&L employees were unable to afford the fares on the very streetcars that they operated. In May 1896, after TMER&L Vice President Payne reneged on a promised 1 cent per hour raise, employees went on a strike that was supported by a community boycott. The streetcar operator, however, brought in strike breakers from Chicago, and most of the original workers were never able to return to their jobs. In the 1898 mayoral election, every major candidate supported municipal acquisition of the streetcar system. After elected, Democrat David S. Rose instead entered into closed-door talks with the TMER&L to consolidate and expand the system, ultimately signing a 35-year exclusive agreement with the line, despite widespread protests of this agreement by Milwaukeeans. The city of Milwaukee attempted to purchase the streetcar system from the TMER&L multiple times between the 1890s and 1950s to no avail, as both the state and anti-tax activists opposed such an acquisition. From less than 12 miles of streetcar line in 1880, when the system was still entirely horse-drawn, Milwaukee streetcar lines grew to 142 miles by 1898, after consolidation and electrification were complete. Between 1890 and 1902, streetcar trackage in Wisconsin as a whole grew by an order of magnitude, from 45.5 miles to 446 miles. And in 1908, streetcars in the state were carrying 300,000 passengers daily. By 1917, downtown Milwaukee had been thoroughly connected to the city's north, west, and south sides by streetcar lines, with Wells Street and Grand Avenue, now West Wisconsin Avenue, having particularly high streetcar traffic. Pictured is an undated circa 1920s photo of an electric streetcar at the Public Service Building, the hub of Milwaukee's interurban system located in its Westtown neighborhood. In 1920, the streetcar network reached 180 miles within city limits alone. However, the Great Depression caused a large loss in trackage, trimming the system to just 105 miles. During this era, the TMER&L attempted to boost revenue with freight service on its streetcar tracks, thus competing directly with delivery trucks in downtown Milwaukee. While automobiles gradually cut into streetcar ridership, there were still surges in the number of streetcar riders that happened with every heavy snowfall during this era. Ultimately being replaced entirely by buses, Milwaukee's former streetcars last operated in 1958. The TMER&L argued that acquiring modern President's Conference Committee, or PCC streetcars, would have been too costly and instead made the case for the increased efficiency offered by rubber-tired trackless trolleys, or trolley buses. PCC streetcars, like those that run on the Heritage streetcar line in Kenosha, never operated in Milwaukee. In 1938, the TMER&L divided its electric power and streetcar holdings on paper in compliance with the Holding Company Act of 1935, but these two divisions remained under common ownership through Parent North American. Pictured here is Gertie Hill sorting tickets in the money room of the Public Service Building, circa 1926. Images of female employees of the TMER&L are few and far between, and almost exclusively depict women working in office settings. While undoubtedly important work, women's job prospects in the transportation field at the time were menial and nearly entirely confined to offices and other indoor settings. Pictured here is the interior of a Milwaukee streetcar circa early 1940s, with a noticeable absence of men of military age. Note the "This is your war too" advertisement at the top left. After World War II, which saw a temporary increase in streetcar ridership, the Federal Trade Commission saw through the loophole that the TMER&L was exploiting and demanded immediate divestment of the streetcar system. During this period, federal 30-year mortgages provided by both the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration also encouraged suburbanization and increased car use, again at the expense of streetcars. The company, by that point the new Wisconsin Electric Power and Light Company, offered to sell the entire streetcar system to the city for $600,000 in 1947, worth over $8.5 million today. But the city could not secure enough funding, in part due to state-imposed debt limits. Because of this, Incoming Mayor Frank Zeidler, who was elected in 1948, attempted to gain enabling legislation from the state to form a metropolitan transit authority to acquire and operate the streetcar system, area interurban rail, and buses. Zeidler was particularly concerned that the streetcar system would be sold to National City Lines, the General Motors-backed company that was already infamous for acquiring and liquidating streetcar systems in favor of bus routes. The suburbs of Waukesha and West Allis both concurred with Zeidler's concern about the TMER&L selling the system to outside interests, but for multiple reasons, municipal acquisition of the streetcar system never occurred. One key reason was the last-minute change of the enabling bill from nonprofit to for-profit status. Moore argues this nonprofit status was integral to the success of any such transit authority, quote unquote. The ultimate result was that the State Public Service Commission allowed the private streetcar system to sell and dismantle itself. Streetcar service persisted for another decade, with the last operating electric streetcar running the Wells Street line in spring 1958, ending streetcar operation in Milwaukee after 68 years. Pictured is the Route 10 Wells Street line streetcar on the Miller Valley Viaduct circa 1958, near the end of service. Photographed by Lyle Oberweis. Streetcars would not run in Milwaukee again until the debut of the HOP modern streetcar system in 2018. In the early 20th century, the potential of electric-powered intercity railways became widely known, especially in the Midwestern United States. This interurban, quote-unquote, model had substantial advantages over steam-powered railroads for short and intermediate distance passenger travel, as well as for small or less than carload freight railroading. In 1895, the TMER&L acquired the Milwaukee-Wauwatosa Railway, a 12-mile line that it subsequently extended to Waukesha, becoming the first true interurban line in the region. Pictured is what is believed to be the first TMER&L interurban to arrive in Waukesha in 1898. Perhaps even more significant was the TMER&L's line south to Racine and Kenosha, which was built between 1897 and 1900, stretching 34 miles to link together three of Wisconsin's most important and most populous cities. While Milwaukee never became a major hub for interurbans the way that Chicago or Cleveland did, it did have several lines by the late 19-teens. By the late 1920s, Milwaukee was connected by interurban to Sheboygan, 58 miles to the north, Waukesha Beach, now Milwaukee Lake, 22 miles to the west, Burlington, 35 miles to the southwest, and Kenosha, 40 miles to the south. This extensive system was collectively patronized by about 30,000 people daily. In total, over 200 miles of Wisconsin's interurban lines connected to Milwaukee. After its 1928 acquisition of the Milwaukee Northern Railway, which ran from Milwaukee to Sheboygan via Port Washington, the TMER&L operated 198 miles of interurban lines in the state. In 1902, it opened the hub of Greater Milwaukee's interurban network, the Public Service Building, pictured in this photo by Lyle Oberweis with the TMER&L interurban train in the foreground. The building still stands today at the corner of North 2nd Street and West Michigan Street. Construction of the TMER&L network continued through the 1900s, with a new 36-mile line reaching East Troy via Hales Corners in 1907, the Waukesha line being extended to Oconomowoc and Watertown by 1908, and the final extension from East Troy to Burlington occurring in 1909. While the North American company prevented extensions to Chicago and Madison, it still invested heavily in the TMER&L interurban system through the 1920s. The Great Depression and increasing competition from cars and highways caused a reorganization of the company. And in 1938, the TMER&L officially became the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Transport Company. Critical and significant abandonments of the TMER&L system in the 1940s occurred in the 1940s, and by 1950, the only two interurban lines that still operated were to Waukesha and Hales Corners. A last attempt at revitalization, a reorganized corporation known as the Milwaukee Rapid Transit and Speed Rail, or simply Speed Rail, which connected Wauwatosa and the Menomonee River Valley with Milwaukee, ultimately failed. This was in part due to two major crashes in 1949 and 50, and the last interurban service on the old TMER&L system ran in June 1951 after the Public Service Commission shut down the remaining routes. Pictured is the aftermath of the 1950 speed rail disaster. Nonetheless, Milwaukee still retained interurban service thanks to the Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee Railroad, often called the North Shore Line. The North Shore Line was built north out of Chicago, reaching Racine in 1906 and Milwaukee in 1908. A bankruptcy that year caused it to be reorganized in 1916 under business magnate Samuel Insull, who owned numerous interurban railroads. With Insull's substantial financial resources, the North Shore Line developed into a route known for fast operation and quality service. In 1941, the North Shore's famous Electroliner streamlined train sets entered service. Pictured is an Electroliner at the North Shore Line's Milwaukee station in 1956. Electroliners were capable of 110-mile-an-hour operation, but were limited to 90 miles an hour due to safety concerns, specifically the speed at which crossing gates on the route could close. The North Shore and their Electroliners held on until 1963, ultimately losing the fight for interurban supremacy with cars, and with it ended the last interurban rail operations serving Milwaukee. In 2009, Milwaukee began planning for a new modern streetcar. Construction began in 2017 on a 2.5-mile-long line that snakes through downtown, mostly in Easttown, but also connecting to the 3rd Ward and Milwaukee Intermodal Station in Westtown. This initial segment of the streetcar, known as the M Line, was funded by $55 million in federal money and a tax incremental financing, or TIF district. In 2016, a plan to extend the western end of the line 1 mile north to what is now Fiserv Forum did not receive federal funds and was not built. The streetcars used are Brookville Liberty streetcars made by the Brookville Equipment Corporation in Pennsylvania, a model popularly used on other modern American streetcar systems, including those in Detroit and Dallas. French public transit operator Transdev has operated and maintained the system's 5 streetcars since their debut. Branded as the Hop and sponsored by Potawatomi Hotel and Casino, the new streetcar line began running in fall 2018. Pictured is a Hop streetcar on the M Line at the intersection of State and Jackson in 2022. In fall 2023, the Hop's long-delayed L Line, which connects downtown to the lakefront at a station in the base of the Couture Luxury Apartment Tower, began Sunday-only operation. Full operation, with the same hours and headway as the M Line, began last month. In 2023, Milwaukee also outlined plans for the expansion of the current streetcar system in 3 other directions. Northeast along Prospect and Farwell from the current terminus at Burns Commons to the east end of Brady Street, north along Bell Phillips Avenue from the current terminus at the station to Fiserv Forum and ultimately Bronzeville, and south into Walker's Point. Extension to Bronzeville is partially to address one of the 2 largest groups critical of the streetcar, predominantly African-American inner-city residents whose neighborhoods are not served by it. The other major group opposed to the streetcar are conservative taxpayers who, instead of primarily being concerned about equity and service levels, are simply opposed to the cost of operating it. Regardless, when considering the amount of tax revenue the streetcar generates for the city from the numerous new developments along its route, many proudly advertising their proximity to a streetcar stop, it more than pays for itself. Thank you for attending my presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
And everyone can feel free to add their questions into the chat, and I will facilitate those to Michael. I'm gonna allow about 5 minutes for questions just to respect everybody's time. So feel free to write those in the chat. All right, I'll do a last call if there's no questions. You can always email us too. Our emails are found on our website under the contact page. So if you have a follow-up question that pops in your head later on, feel free to email us over at the MCHS. All right, well, that was my last call for questions. I am going to close us out today. Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate your time. And thank you to Michael for such a great presentation, very informative, amazing photos from our archives as per usual. So it's great to see them out in the public sphere. Please stay tuned for our upcoming programs. We do have our book club coming up this Monday and Milwaukee History Trivia on Thursday at Amorphic Brewing Company. And part 2 of the history of transportation in Milwaukee, rubber wheels and aviation, will be on Friday, June 21st at noon via Zoom. And if you'd like to see more programs like this one, please consider supporting the Milwaukee County Historical Society. We recognize that Milwaukee history spans across diverse communities, ethnicities, and cultures, so we hope to continue to bring us all together. And with that, thank you, everybody, and have a good one.